Today's topic is budget deficit. What are the various concepts of deficit budget? There are different concepts of budget deficit. First one is revenue deficit. What is revenue deficit? Revenue deficit is nothing but revenue receipts minus revenue expenditure. When the expenditure more than its income, that is revenue deficit. Revenue receipts minus revenue expenditure can be termed as revenue deficit, or D means revenue deficit, revenue receipts minus revenue expenditure. Revenue receipts, net tax revenues and non-tax revenues together can be comes under revenue receipts. Revenue expenditure, planned expenditure, non-planned expenditure of the government comes under revenue expenditure. So revenue deficit is nothing but expenditure is more than its revenue of the government. Earnings, the expected earnings of the government are not enough to cover its basic operations. Then there is a deficit of revenue, income deficiency for the government. Less revenue collected, the expected revenue is not covered. So actual revenue of the government is less than its operations. So earnings are not enough to meet or to cover its basic operations is revenue deficit. The second one is budget deficit or budget financing. What do you mean by the word budget deficit or deficit financing? Budget deficit or financing means is total receipts minus total expenditure. Total receipts of the government, all types of total receipts, capital revenue receipts and capital receipts together comes under total receipts. So total revenue of the government minus total expenditure made by the government. A negative balance is actually a negative balance between government spending and revenues. Government is spending more than its revenue. So it is a negative balance between spending and revenues. Government spends more than it collects in tax revenues. Tax revenues in form of taxes, government can earn money. So when the money collected by the government is less than its expenditure, then it can be termed as budget deficit or budget financing. Third one, fiscal deficit. What do you mean by the word fiscal deficit? This budget deficit plus government borrowings and liabilities. When we add government borrowings and liabilities to the budget deficit, it gives fiscal deficit. Revenue total receipts means revenue receipts plus capital receipts together comes under total receipts. Fourth one, primary deficit. This is a new term, new concept. What is the primary deficit? Primary deficit is nothing but fiscal deficit minus interest payments. What interest to be paid by the government? The interest to be paid by the government on previous years earlier borrowings or loans. Earlier borrowings and loans, government has to pay the interest. And the difference between the current year's financial deficit and the interest payments on earlier borrowings can be termed as primary deficit. There are four important concepts. What are various concepts of deficit budget? Revenue deficit, budget deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit. So there are four important concepts of budget deficit.